It set attendance records opening night. It was box office champ 3 weeks running until Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D. Texas Chainsaw? I weep for America. There Huck goes again with his bleeding heart liberal bullshit. Let's just move on, Clone. We're here to review a film that has most critics divided. Some say it's movie magic at its best. Others claim that it's 1 hour of great cinema buried at the end of a 3-hour film. Which just goes to show you. Show you what, Clone? That most movie critics are complete morons. Which is where Huck and I come in. I'm Huck. I'm Clone. And today, we'll review The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. And we'll set the record straight.
Huck Fit 22. Who should subscribe? Yeah, that's you.
If you were a big fan of the Lord of the Rings movies, you're gonna love this film. Forget what any critics say. Case closed. But all that success with the Lord of the Rings trilogy sure didn't make this production very easy to film. In fact, it was marred by so many calamities and disasters, it nearly killed the director. Around the industry, the production became known as the Curse of the Hobbit. First, there were the financial woes at MGM Studios. It found itself in 2010 nearly $4 billion in debt. They had to get other studios to help fund their production. Then there were all the location problems. I mean, first it was 27 animals used in the films that died on some New Zealand ranch where they were all kept because of, I don't know, huge ruts and craters all over the place that they ran into. The main warehouse caught on fire, injuring 2 crew members and destroying whole sets for the film. Then MGM had to renegotiate the tax structure in New Zealand. And then the New Zealand Actors Union went on strike. It was at this point that the original director of the films, Guillermo del Toro, said, "Fuck this," and walked off the project. Enter Peter Jackson, director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, who somehow pulled this project together, but not before paying a heavy price. Not only did it give him an ulcer, but the ulcer perforated on location, forcing him into a New Zealand hospital for life-saving surgery. That's not an exaggeration. This film nearly killed Peter Jackson. But despite everything thrown at him, Jackson completed the project, which means there's really only 2 things left for you to decide. 1, whether to go see the film, and 2, which version of the film to go see. Well, first there's the 24-frame version, which is like most of the movies we see. Then there's the 24 frames real 3D version, and for those of you who live near an IMAX screen, you can opt to see the new 48 frames high definition real 3D. There's been a lot of criticism of the 48 frame version, mainly because folks say it looks so lifelike that everything in the movie looks fake. It has the feel of watching a soap opera or a behind-the-scenes documentary. Clone and I went to see the 24 frame per second real 3D version. And anyway, besides the whole 48 frames controversy, the main complaints of the film seem to be that, well, it's just too damn long, and 2, that Peter Jackson seemed to stray too far from the original book. Would that be the original version that he wrote in 1937, or the revised edition that came out in the 1950s as he was working on Lord of the Rings, or the revised version that came out later in the 90s when the editors tried to tie all of the stories more together? Exactly, Clone. I get the impression that Jackson is a really big J.R.R. Tolkien fan. Not only of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but of the other writings that the author never really completed before he died. And I think he saw this as the one opportunity to reward other Tolkien fans with as much of his vision as possible. And when else would that opportunity arrive? I mean, other directors had tried to bring these films to life, but the technology just wasn't available back then. And so most of these other attempts before Lord of the Rings failed miserably. And with all of that technology comes cost. You know, Jackson actually wanted to film The Hobbit, not The Lord of the Rings, back in 1995. But I think the more he explored the technology that was necessary to bring these films to life, and the costs associated with them, I think he and the studio both realized that a trilogy of films based on The Lord of the Rings, plus with its bigger good versus evil theme, well, I think he thought that was probably the way to go. But now he finally wanted to get back to doing what he originally sought to do. The Hobbit is really more like a fairy tale. I guess the book is like just under 300 pages. And I guess that's why most critics say that the movie could have been made in, one episode, without all of the extra stuff that Jackson put into the film. Not only that, some critics say that, he dwelt too much on stuff that was in the book that could have been passed over. Which, as you said before, Clone, makes those movie critics morons. And I'll tell you why. I love the movie. I mean it. I loved every minute of it. First of all, I can't think of a single book ever written in which a director, upon trying to bring that book to film, didn't take some license with it. I mean, just look at the Harry Potter films and how much was cut out of those books. Or how much was, basically invented. But besides all that, The Hobbit was originally written by Tolkien as a sort of bedtime story for his daughter. It was only kind of later that as he started working with these characters and their histories and genealogies, and later developed this full story of the fate of the One Ring that Bilbo finds in The Hobbit, that really he realized he had created a whole nother world. It's really a unique work in literature. This was a guy who clearly had too much time on his hands. In fact, it became a ritual for J.R.R. Tolkien later in his life to read back and forth with his friend and co-author C.S. Lewis what they had written most recently. C.S. Lewis? I think I've heard that name. Well, it should sound familiar. C.S. Lewis was the author of the Narnia Chronicles. You know, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Both Tolkien and Lewis were professors of English at Oxford University at the same time. And both of them were just completely obsessed with their writings. In Tolkien's case, he got so in-depth and in detail with his writings that he began developing whole languages for his characters. I mean, there's an entire Elvish language you can study at universities. That's just crazy, Huck. Well, you see, I think that's just the point, Clone. It's certainly not crazy to Tolkien fans. I mean, I think Jackson deserves tremendous credit for trying to balance two completely different things here. One, trying to make a blockbuster movie that would appeal to, general audiences, while at the same time, rewarding those true Tolkien fans who really wanted to see an expansive view of the author's vision. And I think Jackson honestly believed that if he didn't do that now with this film, while he had the unlimited budget basically to do so, when in our lifetimes would it ever be done? Now, I didn't read the book, but I know some critics are saying that the movie just took too long at the beginning to get started on the adventure, which is evidence enough that most movie critics would be horrible movie makers. I mean, the opening of The Hobbit does what all good movies and all good stories do. It reveals a little bit about the characters involved and a little of the background of each of them. I mean, in this case, of course, we learn the history of the dwarves and their mountain kingdom, how it was taken from them, and a little bit about the heroic leadership of their new king, Thorin Oakenshield and how he got that name. I like the scene where they tossed all of Bilbo's dishes around without breaking any. And the scene where Bilbo sits nice and comfy in his little hobbit hole with good food and good drink and absolutely no appetite for adventure. Well, I mean, I think that sets the stage for really the main conflict of the whole first film, which is, you know, the contrast between him and his, you know, not very curious, not very adventuresome nature, and this guy Thorin, the leader of the dwarves, who will risk everything to get his kingdom back. The other thing I liked was, well, we went to see the 24 frames real 3D version, and those effects were just amazing. I mean, it actually felt like things were hitting me when they were tossing that stuff around. That's because things were hitting you, clone. People were throwing their popcorn at you because you wouldn't shut up during the movie. Maybe that's why I felt so buttery after the movie. For those of you who, like me, read the book, you're going to be amazed at how closely the Middle-earth of Peter Jackson's creation matches those of the illustrations of the book. And if you, like me and millions of others, play the Lord of the Rings online game, you're going to be stunned at how closely Jackson's world resembles the online game. I mean, I couldn't get over the Goblin Den with all its, you know, tethered bridges hanging one over the other, and how it looked so much like sections of Goblin Town in the Misty Mountains in the game. At times, it felt like you were playing the online game, you know, with a raiding party. Just enemies coming at you from everywhere. Now, most critics seem to agree that one of the real highlights of the film is the confrontation between Bilbo and the creature Gollum. The Battle of Riddles will truly have you on the edge of your seat. Well, I know it had me on the edge of my seat, partly because there were a few lines by Gollum I couldn't even understand. I mean, I don't know if it was his weird voice or the theater's acoustics. You know, now that you mention it, Clone, I have to agree there was a line or two maybe I had trouble understanding as well. Maybe it helped that I read the book. Definitely read the book. I mean, Tolkien's a fantastic writer, and, well, I'll tell you more when I get done. I'm a pretty slow reader. I've made it to page 10 so far. I agree. I mean, one thing that Tolkien was a master at was his description of landscapes and situations. And the fact that Jackson picked such beautiful scenery in New Zealand is, well, it just matches up so well with my recollection of Tolkien's writings. I know one thing, it sure gives me a hankering to go see New Zealand, where this film was made. I mean, I've never seen such awesome scenery. You took the words right out of my mouth, Clone. So tell me, Huck, why were, you know, at least some of the critics so harsh on this movie? Well, I guess most critics, if they had a complaint about the movie, it fell into one of two categories. One, that it bloated what could have been a much shorter, maybe one episode movie rather than the, you know, several very long movies. And two, I think maybe some of them confused the fact that this isn't Lord of the Rings with a, you know, sinister good versus evil theme at the heart of it. This is essentially a fairy tale. There are plenty of dangers and life and death battles going on, but, you know, some of them, like that first encounter with the trolls, sort of had an almost, I don't know, Tom and Jerry kind of whimsical quality to them. I think Jackson deserves quite a bit of credit for weaving both those whimsical, humorous, fairy tale qualities of the story mixed in with some of the more serious themes that Tolkien later developed for Middle-earth. I mean, it is quite a balancing act to tie all of these, you know, books together. There's no argument. Visually, this movie is absolutely stunning. But as far as like focusing on the 3D effects or a lot of that, while there's a lot of CGI in this movie, I think Jackson does focus quite a bit on the characters, particularly on Bilbo and on Thorin Oakenshield. So I could throw these away? Clone, you were supposed to recycle those after the film. I would, but I think I look kind of cool in them. There are some short little cameos. Now, some of the characters you probably saw in Lord of the Rings. Cate Blanchett as the Lady Galadriel, Hugo Weaving as the Lord Elrond, even a few little scenes there at the beginning of Elijah Wood as Frodo. But essentially, this is a film about Bilbo and the dwarves, assisted, of course, by Gandalf the Wizard. I like Martin Freeman as Bilbo a lot in this. He was so believable. I mean, you kept pulling for him to prove himself to his companions, and yet you could really sense that, you know, he just didn't have it really in him. Or did he? Personally, I gotta tell you, I thought that Bilbo came across as more personable and likable than Frodo in Lord of the Rings. But I guess if there was a shortcoming, it's that Peter Jackson really didn't delve too much into the individual personalities, you know, of the dwarves. Certainly not to the extent that Tolkien does early in the book. But I suspect we're going to see a lot more of the dwarves and how they differ from one another when the second movie comes out a year from now. We have to wait a whole year? Well, that sucks. Well, the second movie is scheduled to appear December 13th, 2013. Well, at least a full year gives me a chance to finish reading the book. I mean, I only have 290 pages to go. Were there any critics that really liked the movie? Well, sure. Lots of them did, Clone. And I would say that probably those critics most familiar with Tolkien's works probably liked it the most. I would say that Peter Howell of the Toronto Star said it best when he said that Jackson made a decision, basically rather than to give less content to appease the, you know, the casual movie fan who would have probably appreciated just a straightforward approach, you know, to the original work. Jackson aimed his sights a little higher and tried to appease those hardcore Tolkien fans by giving them much more content. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was ready to sit and watch parts 2 and 3 right then and there before leaving the theater. I think all in all, Tolkien fans and fans of the original movies, The Lord of the Rings, ought to be very happy that Peter Jackson ended up directing these films. I mean, not only did he have all the experience and research to go on from filming the first trilogy of movies, but I think he took an approach to this film that really was meant to satisfy those of us who have waited so long to see these come to film. I mean, for true Tolkien fans, this may be as close as you're ever going to get to touching the mind of Tolkien himself, at least as far as you can on film. Who can criticize that? I'm Huck. I'm Clone. We'll see you next week with a review of Les Miserables.